Welcome to the first event of the 2012 Sagan National Colloquium. This year's colloquium is, as you probably know, entitled Bite, examining the mutually transformative relationship between people and food. But people kind of just call it Bite. I think it's a lot easier to say than that whole other mouthful of words. My name's Chris Fink, and I'm a faculty member here in the Department of Health and Human Kinetics at Ohio Wesleyan. I'm also the director of the colloquium this year, and I'm very excited for the series. We're bringing all sorts of notable individuals who will all be examining this mutually transformative relationship across the semester that we have with food. We'll also have some other exciting events that go along with the speakers, including a farmers market here on campus on Monday, September 24th, before the speakers. So be sure to check out the schedule of events that's on the handout that some of you received. It's also on the website, bite2012.owu.edu or snc.owu.edu. I'd like to thank Paula Travis. She's the colloquium coordinator, and as well as the student assistants. They've been tons of help in bringing the series to fruition, and I'm pretty sure I've driven them crazy a little with some of the ideas that I've had this year from time to time, so I wanted to be sure to thank them again a little louder with a microphone and things instead of just in person. And also, one of the crazy ideas I wanted to introduce you to was the t-shirts that you may have seen some of the people wearing, Paula and others, around the entrance of the room. And the shirts are actually for a good cause. They are for sale for $10, but the benefit is the OWU Early Childhood Center. They're putting in a food-focused learning garden there, and the children will be planning, building, planting, cultivating, and harvesting the garden as part of the curriculum. And the really cool part is in the summer, the children and their parents will maintain the garden, so the parents and the children will learn about producing their own better food and taking care of themselves and their earth as well. And that'll happen even when school isn't in session. So the logo was designed by a 2012 OWU graduate, Mark Schmitter, and the shirts were made in Columbus, Ohio, so we're trying to keep it all as local as we can, and those are something that you can pick up after the event if you'd like. So as the director of the series, food is really, I think, clearly important to me. I interact with it every day in work, from teaching about the health impact of food on our bodies and our communities, to writing about food in research work, to even traveling with students to Italy to examine food culture and environmental factors that influence dietary choices and health, to something like tonight where I'm frantically cooking with my wife Julie for our daughter Amelia, our son Luca. They're 4 and 1, and they have some really strong verbal ideas about why food is important to them as well. So we interact with it on a daily basis for sure. I look across at my family history, and I've been asking for recipes and ruining things in the kitchen, as well as doing some successes as well. And my interest in food culture and tradition, all this stuff has influenced my work here and beyond. But tonight's not about me and my take. It's on the panel discussion, why is food important? Food across the disciplines at Ohio Wesleyan. Actually, leading up to the series, we asked a number of different groups around our community and our campus community why food is important to them, to get a better sense of the issues that are at hand. So what I thought I would do is read you a few of those responses, just so you get a sense of why people that you see every day think that food is important. And these are so good, I promise that we didn't pay them. I mean, we may have given away a shirt or something, but beyond that, it was just amazing to me to read some of these. Okay, so food, so I'll read some. Food has kept me grounded throughout my life. Growing up, the majority of my meals consisted of vegetables grown on my own land and meat from animals I personally knew and cared for. The importance of food and the respect it needs is part of my core values. Food is like music. It's an international language that can create bonds that otherwise may not have formed. It allows us to experience the world and connect with everyone. Food is important to me because it can keep us alive or it can kill us. We use it for fuel, but too much can make us sick. Food is its own art. It taps into creativity, passion, curiosity when we cook and share something of ourselves with others. Food brings me down to earth when I need it and makes me calm and happy. I liked this one. As an Italian, nice, food is central to our culture and my family. I learned how to make gnocchi with my grandfather and how to slice tomatoes, as well as what makes a good olive oil. When it's time to eat, the family crams around the table, steaming dishes are piled high, and laughter pours out like the homemade red wine. This is a travel writer or a cookbook writer and budding something, I don't know, this is great. Food is important to me because it's a large part of the world I want to go into, microbiology. Chris Wolverton approves. Companies like Monsanto are on the cutting edge of plant genetics and transgenic research. We all need to eat, but I worry about our water being ruined, global warming and droughts, and the dependence that we have on corporate agriculture. My mother told me about starving children in China and that I had to clean my plate. I appreciate how local food can be healthier and safer for our bodies. And finally, food is a hobby and, to a lesser extent, a necessity. It's cool to hear about how people interact and find food to be important. These themes, and we have more, and we want more, show the range of ways through which food impacts our lives. So if you're interested, if that spurs some thoughts for you and you're interested in answering the same question, some of you students have already answered it, but some of you students haven't answered it, we would love to have you do that. There are some note cards on the table at the back, so on your way out, after you're totally fired up about food from our panel's talk, then please tell us why food is important to you. But tonight we're going to hear, finally, from our fantastic faculty panel, all of whom are on the faculty here at Ohio Wesleyan and who represent a variety of disciplines. They're also very interested in food, and they've found ways to integrate this in their work, whether it's their research, their classroom work, a combination of those and other initiatives. The way the panel discussion works is it'll last for about an hour, and then we plan to have the remaining time for questions from you, from the audience members. The goal of the panel really is to demonstrate how we weave food throughout our personal lives, our professional lives, our disciplinary lives, and how that topic crosses disciplines. As you'll hear, we have people from a variety of disciplines, and how many food-related topics actually require that we individually cross disciplinary boundaries to really understand the larger larger questions or issues at hand related to food. So I think that the discussion will leave you really looking forward to the remainder of the series, and that the range of points of view will be that'll be represented in the discussion about food will help to achieve that. So, to start, panelists, if you could just kind of introduce yourselves with your name and your area of work, and then we'll get into the actual questions. So these are just some pretty straightforward things.
I'm Sherry Stone-Mediatore. I teach in philosophy and in the Women's and Gender Studies and Environmental Studies program, and I teach about food and agriculture in my environmental ethics class.
My name is David Walker, and I teach cultural geography, economic geography, urban geography, Latin American geography here, and the way that I talk about food in my classes is how we mobilize our identities around food, and also food production and environmental issues in food and labor issues in food.
I'm Chris Wolverton. I'm in the Department of Botany and Microbiology. I teach cell biology and genetics and plant physiology, and I also teach a summer class on food, which examines kind of some of the science and some of the plant science behind food, where it comes from, and how our bodies use it, how we've used it, how food has been domesticated.
And I'm Mary Howard. I'm a member of the Sociology Anthropology department, and in that department I'm an anthropologist. And in anthropology I specialize in medical anthropology, and in that field I specialize in nutritional anthropology. So my class, Health, Illness, Disability, Death, and Dying, takes up a lot of food issues, as does the introductory course Cultural Anthropology, when we talk about all kinds of subsistence agricultural strategies that people the world over have.
Great, so you can see there's a variety of areas of focus represented here. So the first question to the community and to some of the students here even was the importance of food in their lives. So I'm really going to ask the same of our panelists, and they're going to want to talk about their disciplines. But first, I really want them to talk about themselves and why food as individuals is important to them. I think that we'll definitely get to your disciplines and things, but where does it start with you? What is it inside of you that makes food such a large part of your life? Something in a history, something else that's influenced that. And we'll start back at the other end again with Mary, if you don't mind.
Okay, well, I'm an Ohioan, brought up by two Irish parents, one who was from the rural area, Mechanicsburg, Ohio. The other was from Columbus, Ohio. So I had an urban and rural background. My mother and father both had a garden, and Mom was always eat your vegetables. and fruit's kind of a nutrition-sensitive person. My dad had wonderful memories of his upbringing in the farm, and my grandparents were still alive and on the farm, so I had the opportunity to go and spend a lot of time on the farm on the weekends. But I was kind of an independent, curious, kind of mischievous, if not naughty little girl. So I'd go to the farm, and Grandpa said that 2 weeks after I collected eggs, the chickens wouldn't lay any more eggs. And I was taught how to milk a cow, and I was found at the age of 4 underneath the bowl trying to milk the bowl. That didn't work. Just in general, had a grand old time out in the country. I also was a very picky eater, so I sort of snubbed a lot of things. And being Irish, it was curious that I couldn't stand potatoes, which I had all kinds of strategies as to where to hide them in my pockets and so on. So that's a little bit of me.
Okay, I guess where my interest in food began was, this is probably, most of the room won't remember this person, but I used to watch a TV show, and it was on, I think it was on every night, but there was a guy on it called Chef Tell. And I was fascinated. He was like before the TV show cook genre started. And so he got me interested. And in second grade, the first book that I wrote, I declared that I was going to be a chef, and I wrote like 4 recipes. And this is one of those, they bind it for you at school, and it's, your own homemade book. And so I've been interested, genuinely interested, since that time in food and in cooking. And as I've kind of grown up, I began gardening, and that kind of interest in plants took off for me, and that's sort of what I pursued professionally. But I've remained interested in food and in cooking as an experimental science, as a way to mix flavors and to understand how foods interact with each other. And how our processing of them changes them chemically, and I also like to eat, so that's there.
I am born and raised in San Francisco, California, and my mom is a restaurateur and caterer, so I was born into a food family, and my dad writes about wine, so there was always food around the house, and my mom always fed us the most organically, locally healthiest foods that we could get, and food was always a conversation around the table and around the house, and so it was always an integral part of my upbringing. We developed, me and my brothers and sisters, we developed a very eclectic taste for foods, and so when I was in second, third grade, I demanded that I wanted to bring sardines to school with me because that was my favorite food at the time. And so I would bring these sardines with me to school, and I'd bring a box of crackers and some carrots and some spinach and these kind of things. And it was really upsetting the rest of the kids because they had white bread bologna sandwiches or peanut butter and jelly sandwiches. And the recess monitor would admonish me for doing this, and finally the administration got aware that I was bringing sardines to school, and I was actually asked to leave school. No, I was asked to not bring sardines to school anymore, and I continued to do so. Then I was asked to leave. They were going to suspend me for a day for bringing sardines to school. This very, very much upset my mother because, as we know, sardines are one of the most healthiest foods you can eat, right? They've got more protein than steak. They got more vitamin D than milk. They're one of the best foods we can eat. They're also are ecologically correct to eat sardines the way that they're lying caught. And growing up in San Francisco, most of the sardines that we eat on the West Coast are come out of the Carmel Bay or off the seas of Monterey and the Pacific Coast. And my mom got very upset about this, and we had to sit down with the teachers and with the administration, and then indeed I was allowed to bring sardines to school again. So this is just an example of how important food was to our family and to myself growing up.
Do you still bring sardines to class or anything?
Well, I tried to, it's fun when you have a seminar to bring some snacks, and so I brought sardines and anchovies and, olive stuffed with blue cheese and these kind of things. The students, apparently, they like, graham crackers and Oreos more. But
Good for you for trying. Sorry to interrupt, Sherry.
It's okay. Since everyone said a little bit about their upbringing, I'll say that I grew up in a suburb of Chicago, and I had the Pop-Tarts and white bread, peanut butter and jelly sandwiches, and Velveeta cheese. But I did escape there, and I went to school in Ann Arbor, and I first started thinking about the broader social significance of food when I was about the age of most of you. And I got my own apartment with several other women, and it was the first time that we started cooking for ourselves. And this was in Ann Arbor in the 1980s, so we were very influenced by Frances Moore Lappé's book, Diet for a Small Planet. And I was already a vegetarian. I had been so for a while, but Lappé helped me to think about the broader social and environmental implications of our eating practices. And since then, I've gotten very frustrated whenever I see trendy diets like the Atkins diet or other popular diets that are all about, losing weight or the health of an individual, usually affluent Americans, but don't think anything about how your diet also affects the community and the land and other people around you. So I think Lappé's insight was very important, that a healthy diet for an individual also has to be a healthy diet for our land and for the community around us. So I moved to DC when, I guess it was about the late 80s, and went to live in a group house, and many of the group houses for young people there advertised that they only wanted people who didn't smoke and didn't eat meat. And I know that might sound very restrictive to some of you, but in those days, not eating meat was still very much rooted in eating more simpler foods, eating a lot of beans and grains and local produce, and being aware of where your food came from and the broader implications of how that food was grown. Vegetarianism wasn't so trendy and gourmet as it is today, but still very much rooted in is a popular saying during that time that some of you might remember was, live simply so that other people can simply live. And eating foods that were simple and low resource intensive so they didn't take a huge toll on our planet was an important part of that, living simply so other people could simply live. And I think Thoreau is also right, if any of you cook for yourselves, that eating simpler vegetarian diets are also a lot less messy. So that was an important part of my housemates and I following that kind of diet.
That's great. So you get a sense, at least I do, excuse me, of hearing where people are coming from. And maybe this is me because I know you all at least a little bit, that I can hear the story starting to come out. Like I can see where maybe it was going, because the next question, of course, is more about the discipline. I mean, one of the other goals for this is to show how food is not just whatever our narrow conception may sort of tell us it is. It's not just a culinary act. It's not just a health behavior. In my field, sometimes it gets lost in that. So the next question is related to that. How do you interact with food in your discipline? So the first thing, if you could do for us, is to sort of describe how you conceive your discipline, because I think even for me as a faculty member, I don't always fully understand how you understand your own discipline. What is it actually studying and working toward? And then that's the first part, so describe that. Then the second is, how do you, as a person in that discipline, work with food? Choose something in class, research, link it all together, like the story is what I'm sort of looking for. So, and I think that will help the discussion. So Chris, let's start with you.
Okay. I guess the first question, what is my discipline? I'm a plant molecular biologist by training. And so what that means is that I'm interested in understanding how plants function at the cellular and molecular level. What is it, for example, what's the process that allows those leaves that are outside the window to collect light and convert that light into sugar? That's ultimately where all of the energy, all the food that we eat, starts there. And so my discipline has that as one of its questions. How does that process work? That's actually still, we're learning a lot about that, even though we've been studying it in earnest for 40 or 50 years with really what I would consider kind of modern biological tools, we're still understanding and working out how those pigments in the leaves act to collect light and convert it into chemical bonds, carbon-carbon bonds. And so that's one major question in my discipline. Other questions are, for example, how do plants deal with drought? How is it that some plants can survive being submerged underwater, for example, some varieties of rice, for a week at a time, and others can't? We've just recently learned that a single gene difference in one cultivar versus another can allow submersion tolerance. And so that's another area of interest in plant physiology, plant growth and development. How do plants acquire everything they need from the soil? To mine the soil, plants need essential elements to take in, to build all sorts of proteins and other structures that are necessary for growth. How do plants control that? How do they control the growth direction? And that's in fact an area of active research that my lab studies, is how do plants control which way they're growing. So that's sort of, in a nutshell, how my discipline interacts with the question that ultimately relates to food, because as I said before, all food at some point comes from plants, comes from this process of photosynthesis. Whether we're eating meat, those animals were fed a diet of some kind of plant, or whether we're eating, as Sherry mentioned, if we have a vegetarian diet and we're relying directly, cutting out the middleman or the middle cow, and relying directly on plants as our source of protein and carbohydrate. And so that's kind of the discipline angle. My interest picks up, let me make sure I've got the question right. So that's that question of how do we understand how plants grow and develop so that we can move to an area of application. If we understand, how can we improve? So I mentioned the example of flooding tolerance in rice. Just in the last few years, we've learned a lot about how that works, and that's important because flooding fields is the major form of weed control in subsistence rice farming in particular. And so to have a cultivar of rice that you can flood and it won't die is very important. And if we understand at kind of the cellular or molecular level how that process is regulated, scientists in my field are interested in understanding that and being able to apply it to very real-world questions of not only flooding tolerance, but also questions of malnutrition, getting enough protein in the diet, getting enough vitamins. There's a whole area of study in my discipline called biofortification, which is interested in understanding plants and introducing traits into plants that, for example, can remediate vitamin A deficiency, which causes blindness in about 100, well, depending on the estimate, about 100,000 children a year. And so to be able to introduce a pathway into a plant that remediates that problem in a form that allows a subsistence diet still to be eaten, and you're not trucking in, fresh vitamin, for example, every day or something. To my manner of thinking, that's an important and worthwhile cause. I just made mention earlier, I guess we're going to get to how it relates to my own personal work in my discipline, so I'll save that for later.
Well, you can jump into that part of the
Okay.
question. So yeah.
Well, some other areas that plant science is interested in, most estimates say that humanity is because of population growth, is going to need to increase food production by 50% or so over the next 30 to 40 years. And that's certainly an active area of research for understanding, and that, by the way, is going to need to be done with no additional inputs. And so we've seen that kind of increase in productivity and in that kind of yield in what's called the green revolution, really, since the late 1950s. But most of the increase in yield over that sort of the last 50 years or 60 years has come from really dramatic increases in things like fertilizer and pesticides and all sorts of things that are either very toxic in the environment or we're running out of, or cost a lot in terms of oil, which is also a resource that's quickly diminishing. And so my field is concerned with not increasing yield while increasing inputs, but increasing yield while decreasing inputs. And so what that's going to require is understanding and engineering, in some cases, plants to make do with less nitrogen and less phosphorus. Just 2 days ago, a paper was published describing a minor tweak, a genetic tweak to a particular model organism that allows them to use the mineral phosphite instead of phosphate. And phosphate is one of the major agricultural inputs and major runoffs into streams and lakes that causes algal blooms and things. For phosphite, on the other hand, is readily available in almost every agricultural system. And so these kinds of what seem like really abstract, really, too small to care about sorts of advances, they sometimes have a seed of really revolutionizing the way we grow food and the amount of input that we make into our agricultural production system just by the slightest change. And so I'm particularly interested in that. My lab has been working for the last 3+ years on a project to understand how it is that lateral roots orient themselves in the soil. We have sort of in most root systems, there's a main root that grows down, and branch roots, what we call lateral roots, that come off the primary root at various angles, and we're interested in understanding how those angles change under different phosphate regimes. And we've shown, in fact, that the root has very direct control. It sort of knows how much phosphate that it's growing in, and it can change the angle of those lateral roots. If you grow it in less phosphate, it will actually grow deeper into the soil. And when it does that, it's growing deeper, and so it's changing the angle it sort of wants to be. It's also changing the rate that it responds to stimuli. And so we've just learned this in the last couple of years, and this is a very basic research question that a couple of your peers undertook starting about 3 or 4 years ago, 2 of whom just graduated in the spring and 1 the year before. And we have, it's sort of one small step toward understanding a little bit better how this very important macronutrient in the soil that plants need, phosphorus, how that can affect plant growth. And so those are some of the kind of outlines of how food impacts and works in my discipline. I'll let someone else talk for a while.
If someone, and this is where we can flow a little, if someone feels there's a connection to their discipline, that's the kind of thing that would be great to see. I can think of a few, but feel free to jump in, or I'll just point to somebody, just like it's class. Sherry.
Okay. I can't think of any connections, sorry, but maybe you all can. Philosophy, I'll say a little bit about. It encompasses a lot of different things, but I think most basically philosophy is reflection on the basic values and beliefs that guide our lives and the beliefs that underlie our knowledge practices and all of the other disciplines. Socrates, as you probably know, thought about philosophy as leading an examined life, helping us to examine our lives. So you might think that to lead an examined life means that you should examine the 3 or more meals that you eat a day. But in fact, philosophy for thousands of years was not too interested in food or the people who cook our food. Plato denigrated cooking. He thought it was an art well beneath the other practical arts. And Aristotle thought the best activity was philosophical contemplation because it was self-sufficient. It didn't depend on anything else. He seemed to forget that the philosopher depended on the people who grew and cooked and served their food. I don't know about you, but I don't philosophize too well when I'm hungry. So philosophers for a long time, though, didn't recognize that we are bodily beings who depend on food, and this was an important part of our life. And I think this denigration of food is linked to deeper binaries in the Western tradition that you could see is centered around the division between the mind and the body, and the valorization of the mind as being more important than the body, and all kinds of other hierarchies are related to that. So you have the valorization of reason over emotion, and male qualities over feminine qualities, and culture over nature. And because philosophy has so much valued the mind and reason and denigrated the body and emotion and things connected with nature, for a long time it has seen food issues as not important to philosophy. But there are, recently there has been an interest in what's called the philosophy of food. And I have one philosopher, Andrew Borghini, describes it this way. He says, the philosophy of food reflects on the ethical, political, social, artistic, identity-defining aspects of food. It spurs from the challenge to ponder more actively our diets and eating habits so as to understand who we are in a deeper, more authentic way. And basically, I think the philosophy of food recognizes that we are also bodily beings. And to recognize that doesn't mean to reverse the hierarchies. It doesn't mean to say that the body is more important than the mind, or nature is more important than culture, but it's to recognize that those two things are always interconnected. We are never just rational people. We also have bodies, and we also live in the world. And to lead an examined life is to also examine the meals we eat every day. Carol Adams, I think, has a nice way to put this. She says, if an unexamined life is not worth living, then the unexamined meal may not be worth eating. And I think that this reclaiming of the place of food in philosophy is very important to philosophy because it's starting to recognize that philosophy is grounded in this living world. And also, it's grounded in practices outside of the university, because when you start thinking about food, you start recognizing that we have to appreciate the wisdom of farmers, we have to have real practical experience with the land, and so it starts challenging a lot of the hierarchies in philosophy that I think, well, that many people think have limited philosophy. So the philosophy of food is this new area that many people are interested in, and there's an issue of philosophy now recently that has been dedicated to the philosophy of food. So I think it's adding a lot to philosophy.
And so how do you, I'm thinking of some of the ways you embedded in your work, I know does actually connect with some of the work that Chris was talking about in terms of how the land and inputs maybe interact and all of that. So, but.
Do you want me to talk about the environmental ethics class?
Yeah, please.
Well, I teach about food specifically in the environmental ethics class, and I started developing a unit on food because about 4 or 5 years ago, I think longer ago than any of you are here, at the end of my semester of environmental ethics, I invited a local farmer to come speak in the class, and he took the students outside and led some fun activities with the students outdoors. And the majority of students did not want to participate in the activities because they did not want to touch the dirt. And I thought, this is a problem. I've been teaching about environmental ethics for a semester, and my students don't want to touch the dirt. So after that, I started integrating some more hands-on practical activities throughout the semester, but I also developed a unit that was specifically on food and agriculture. And the food unit in the environmental ethics class, I think, was really important for making concrete the broad environmental issues that we were dealing with, because, you know, as you said in the beginning, everybody has something to say about food. Everybody knows that their everyday lives couldn't go on without eating, and in our eating practices, we are directly related to the land, we're directly related to the people who grow and prepare our food, and we are related to the bugs that we find in our food that decompose our food. So it's a very concrete way to start recognizing our relations to the land as well as to people and the interconnections between those. And I also integrate in this unit on food visits to local farms and composters and food distributors, and I think that's a way to learn from people who work with the land every day, because there's only so much. I mean, you can learn from books, but I think gaining appreciation for our connection to the land and for the wisdom of people who work the land is something that is best learned from going out to the farms and meeting some of these people.
That's great. So we've got two very different disciplines here looking at the same topic, food, and differently from different angles, yet we're starting to touch the land in both of those disciplines. We can't always draw those direct connections that way, but the topic is crossing disciplines, no doubt. David, why don't you talk a little about your discipline, what it is, and then also how you work within that to use food as part of it.
Okay. So geography is a very inherently interdisciplinary subject, and I'm trained as a cultural geographer. And what we do in cultural and human geography is we look at human and nature interactions and how these human nature interactions coalesce to produce different cultures, different economies, different cities, and place and region around the world. So you can look at how culture in the relationship between human nature interactions produces place, and how place is always in the process of becoming, it's always changing based upon these interactions. So relating it to, say, what Chris was talking about this particular variety of rice that can still grow when it's underneath water. This is a great example of, say, then this also will dictate then the type of decisions that people will make that live around this particular rice. So they'll take the fact that perhaps they live like along the Gambia River in Africa, where they have lots of flooding, where I believe this rice comes from, right? Doesn't it? So they'll use this particular aspect of the natural environment where they have a rice varietal that will grow under flooding conditions, and they will adapt their cultural practices and their gastronomical practices to this particular aspect of the natural environment. So within the discipline of geography, the way that geographers think about food is from a very, very broad perspective. So right away we think about food as a form of the mobilization of identity politics, right? Because food plays such an important role in the way that we define ourselves. One of the first things you notice when you travel anywhere around the world, or maybe for many of you who have come here to Central Ohio from a different place in the United States or from a different country, you notice right away there are different food practices when you come here. I know that when I first left California to go to the University of Kentucky, it was my first time out of California, but I have to say I'm rather provincial. It was my first time to live outside of California within the United States. Was when I came to University of Kentucky to do my PhD work, that I was taken aback by the different food practices and food cultures that exist in Kentucky compared to, say, Southern California, where I had lived, or in the Bay Area. So food plays a very major role in the way that we identify ourselves and the way that we can also identify particular different cultures globally. Relating to what Sherry talked about from the environmental issues in food, well, we need to think about food across different scales as well, and geographers think about these kind of things, not getting too technical for you, but we need to think about food from the global scale to the regional to the local and to our bodies also, right? Because you are what you eat. It's a cliche, but it's true. And so geographers think a lot about distribution networks. They think about food miles when it comes to what you're eating. We are thinking about the fact that maybe the bottle of orange juice that you had this morning can have orange juice concentrate in it that can come from Brazil as well as from Florida, and you don't necessarily know what you're eating all the time. So this is looking at food across these particular different socially produced scales, which is important to understand. And then we're also thinking about food, and within this idea of thinking about food and environmental issues, well then food and health issues as well, right? That what we're consuming directly reflects then upon your well-being and how you're going to be able to contribute to society, how you're going to be able to contribute as a well-informed global citizen, right? So it's related to consumption, it's related to production, it's related to identity, and it's related to environmental issues, the way we look at, think about food within the discipline of geography.
Great. And Mary?
And last, anthropology, what is that field? It's a very, very broad field. It studies humans, and it's humans throughout time. So if we've been here for 4 million years, anthropologists, specifically the archaeology end of it, looks at human remains. The physical anthropology looks at the human body. and the linguistic end is the use of language. I am mostly one, I've had all 4 fields, but I've come to identify with cultural anthropology, and it's so much like geography, cultural geography. So we look at people's strategies to subsist. That could be foraging, that could be pastoralism, that could be horticulture and forms of agriculture and mechanized agriculture. We look at where people live, just like geographers do, in urban areas, rural areas, and so on. So my work was done in East Africa, and for this work, I'm going to beg Elaine to come up and press the magic button, because anybody who knows me, I cannot tell these stories without pictures. I teach a film class, by the way, and she's my help to get that up there. So where did I go to do my research? Mount Kilimanjaro in Tanzania, where Carly, who's sitting out in the audience, went with me last semester. I drugged them back to Kilimanjaro. So here's this mountain. It's primarily people who took up coffee farming through the European influence that really changed the original form of society. Here's a picture of the mountain up closer, very rich, deep soil. The coffee farming and the rich soil made for the wealthiest group in Tanzania. There are people known as the Chaga, but yet they had the highest rates of childhood malnutrition. So my question that I went to do research was, explain that paradox. Why would the wealthiest people have the highest rates of child malnutrition? So I go off to Kilimanjaro, not just to do that research, but also to start my family. I was a young woman, married for 5 years. We'd put it off, and so we're going to have our family start. This is a little bit of in the country, up in the cultivation zone, where you see some coffee growing along with other foodstuffs. So I've started my family, and I think you can guess which one is mine. That is my son Matthew, firstborn, whose godfather, Lazaro, is holding him. And the 2 youngsters down below were orphans that Lazaro adopted, and they all lived with us. We raised chickens, pigs. You can see one being sold off to the community. We raised vegetable gardens, fruits, and goats. And we put everybody to work, including Matthew, goat herding here. One of the reasons that we saw this paradox is because the traditional form of safety net, basically that kin should take care of one another, and in particular, wealthy kin were responsible by virtue of the religious system. In other words, you would have misfortune should one of your kin go wanting. And what happened with the colonialism that brought the coffee and brought in cash was a great gap in wealth between people. And the cash economy is kind of hard news on this kind of safety net, because everybody's needs now are unending. You can't just kind of work off a favor of a wealthy family. So you have beautiful homes like this, and you have homes like this. So poor people were the cause of this high rate of malnutrition, where there weren't jobs available or menial jobs. You could spend 8 hours in a day picking coffee and get 50 cents. That was back in the 1970s. I forgot to mention I was there from 70 to 75. And in those 5 years, the middle 2, there was a famine. So something like 1/4 of heads of households came asking for food relief, food crisis. There wasn't sufficient food. And we had already started to develop a nutrition center, which I was part of. Here I am with my friend, the director, standing in front of this nutrition center. But in the face of a full-blown famine, a nutrition center which has its primary focus being education isn't going to be much help, because the real cause of this inability to get sufficient food to children was poverty, lack of cash, lack of land to be able to utilize for growing food, especially when the land you have is planted with coffee, a cash crop. So these are some of the children who I spent time with who had been at the nutrition center. I did a follow-up study to find out what's wrong with this program. It just doesn't seem to be working. There are families coming back with the children who'd been there. Supposedly the mothers had been well educated and knew what to feed them, and so on. This is a child with full-blown kwashiorkor. Her name is Adija. She was a member of a family with 4 other siblings, and this little girl has what's called moon face. She's swollen in her face, her hair is falling out. Oftentimes the hair turns color, the belly becomes swollen, and the skin becomes so tight that if you scratch it for whatever reason, it becomes ulceric, and the child doesn't want to be touched. They also get depressed and they're apathetic. So paradoxically, they don't want to eat, which is a real challenge when you're there and you're confronted with this and you want to save the children. Adija died, and her older brother, Hamisi, here again you can see the moon face. You can't quite see the swollen belly, but his was. Spindly limbs, and he also died. I don't have the picture of the one child who survived intact. 2 other boys also survived, but were stunted. This is a picture of a child who was stunted. He's 2.5. His name is Revakarti, and he had not yet walked at 2.5. And one of the impoverished fathers said, please, let's compare your children in this picture so people will see what's happening to us. My son was 2.5, and he's twice the size of Revakarti. Here's the stunting effects. This is Revakarti at the age of 21. And if anybody knows me, I'm 5'4", and clearly this is part of the ill effects of prolonged malnutrition. And that family, whose father was sick, said, if you think we have problems, you need to meet the Lucas Tempest family. This older gentleman had these children who, by the way, he died 10 days after this photo was taken. And these children are 2 young boys. The smallest in the kind of whitish outfit is 11. His 10-year-old brother is next to the little girl in between, who has the kind of reddish outfit on. He's 10. The little girl is 8, and you can see she's thriving better. And the girl next to me is 14. She was the bread earner for the family. She was out harvesting coffee at 50 cents a day, and probably at a shared bowl, she may have favored her little sister, or the fact that these boys will receive no inheritance. The land that they own, you're looking at. So there's a kind of horrible thing that happens in food scarcity, and that is sometimes parents invest in some children more than others, and apparently that's a world pattern. And in this case, it was the girls who survived. The boys died, the mother died, the father died. But these girls, in further trips back, did survive, and here they're showing off 2 of their own children. So that was, how do you turn this damn thing off?
That ties in actually to what Chris was talking about, and how we're going to have to double our food production within the next 20, 25 years if we're going to feed everyone around the globe. But also it takes into consideration issues like, why are people producing coffee and receiving food aid? Why are you relying on a cash crop and then you're receiving food from international donors and grain that's heavily subsidized in the United States will go to these particular countries instead of surviving in some subsistence form of agriculture? And why are we using grains to produce fuel? When we stop using grains to produce fuel, we would be able to feed people in a much more efficient way. You piqued my interest with your story because when you do research as a social scientist, food always plays an incredibly important role. And while I don't specifically study food when I go do research, but food always plays an enormous role in me being able to make connections with the people that I'm studying. That there was a famous anthropologist that said if you want to be a good ethnographer, well, you need to have a high tolerance for alcohol, and you need to be able to eat anything they give you, right?
Well, that's my end comment and my whole thing. I'm no longer a picky eater.
Exactly. So I've done research in Oaxaca, Mexico, and Mexico City, and then over this summer I'm taking my research in a different direction where I'm looking at the mobilization of black identity politics on the Costa Chica, Guerrero, and Oaxaca, Mexico, and how these folks in this particular area want to form their own autonomous region. And I spent 2 months there, 2.5 months there over the summer looking at this. So basically these people are saying we're not indigenous, we're not mestizo, we're not Mexicans, we're Afro-Mexicans. We want to have our own autonomous area so we can get money for tourism and for development projects and these kind of things. And it was very interesting spending time with these families there. And I've mostly worked in urban areas. And so I was doing stuff like going fishing with them and eating the foods they ate, and sleeping in a hammock with them, these kind of things. And so I'm also in the process of writing a book right now, and one of the chapters is going to be called Just Get in the Boat. And because what you have to do is you can't really, as in order to do ethnography in this particular setting, is you can't you can't hold back, because if you show you're scared to go do something, then you lose the confidence of these people. And so it was very interesting to see how food, in this sense of gathering food, played such a huge role in their identity and their life and how they're living along the coast. So they weren't tied in necessarily, they were tied into sort of global systems of capitalism in different aspects, but as far as their food production and consumption, it was very, very locally based. And so the way that they divided their days up was much different than, say, the way we are required. You know, you all have to be at cultural geography at 9 in the morning and these kind of things, right? And, but they lived along the ideas of the tides, right? So when you could take your boat out and get out of the lagoon, when you could come back in, when it was good time to go pick clams, when it was a good time to go fish for lobsters, when it was a good time to go fishing further out, 2 or 3 miles out, and be able to get tunas and true snapper and these other kind of crops. So it was quite fascinating to see how food played a big role in this. And for example, they would hover in their small boats with the outboard motor, and they would hover just beyond the rocks, and then they would bring these large stones with them and put them in the boat. And at first the first time I went out with them, I thought it was for ballast for the boat, so it wouldn't fall over. But no, what it is, you grab the stone and you jump off the boat with it, and then pull you down to about 25 feet below the water, and then you fish around. You can barely see, and you just move your hand around until a couple lobsters pinch your hand, and then you grab the lobsters and you swim back up very quickly. So I got to do these kind of things with them. It was quite incredible. And then I felt really bad one day. Yeah, exactly.
You sure you did?
Yeah, I did. Yeah. One day they were really excited because they had, that evening, one of the members of the community had found a giant turtle laying her eggs on the beach. And these are an endangered species, right? And they're protected by, finally they're protected by the Mexican government. Back like in 1992, they finally passed a law of this. But this was an incredible find for them. They were making a really big deal out of it, and it's supposed to be considered a really macho kind of thing. You have to eat the eggs. And so they said, come and eat the turtle eggs. I'm like, oh man, I don't want to eat the turtle eggs. I really don't want to eat the turtle eggs. And it's like 95 degrees outside. These eggs have been sitting around, all day long. They're about this big. The shell is not like a chicken egg shell. It's this gelatinous shell. And then what they do is they just bite the top of this gelatinous shell off and put a little bit of lime in, and they suck all the contents of the eggs out. But I bit, what was it called? Bit the bullet, and I went for it and ate these eggs. I felt really guilty about having eaten an endangered species. So it's much different than these ideas of food scarcity, but then how food plays a role of being able to connect with different folks.
What's really interesting across all of these stories, if you're picking up on it, is that the bigger questions that we're trying to answer globally, and not just that you're trying to answer, but the bigger questions that society is trying to answer, need all of this many times. Need all of these disciplines, and I think that's one of the benefits that we have here is that we do have cross-disciplinary thinkers. I think around this campus, we're fortunate for that, and the bigger answers, the bigger answers to the bigger questions will probably come from people who can look at these topics, food or other topics, from a variety of those disciplinary angles. And here you have scholars in each of their fields starting to cross those bridges just a little bit or a lot in some cases to answer some of these really big, great questions. So there is one other point I want to get to, but I'm going to try to ask you to make it relatively short, and that is, when we work with this, or at least when I do, I'm not the same after. In other words, if I'm studying something about food, my approach or my interaction on a day-to-day basis with food has changed just because I've done that. That's that mutually transformative relationship that we're talking about. So if you can give us a minute or two about how you think maybe your interaction with food that's come along has, from way back, has changed because of the work you do. And we'll just go like the minute version or two, if you don't mind. Yeah, Mary, please.
Okay. Well, I already said, I confessed, I'm no longer a picky eater, but probably the biggest challenge for me was coming here as a professor and having spent all this time focused on the problem of poverty. So how can I make that relative to students here at Ohio Wesleyan? And this was back in 1985. A shelter had opened in Columbus, and a new problem, a new kind of poverty, one that I would basically say is something like having untouchables in our society, had developed as a consequence of the 1970s recession, and that was called homelessness. So I ended up going down to the shelter and then eventually bringing students with me, and then getting very attached to the people who work there, the people who live there, and then got involved in fighting for that shelter's survival. Eventually, I started filming that process and had footage and didn't know what to do with it, and how can a faculty member here buy some time to learn about how to put a film together? You teach a film class. So that's partly how. The other thing too, medical anthropology, the #1 correlate with poor health in the United States and elsewhere is poverty. So that's become, if you will, my bag since I've been here.
Well, where I've gone, I think, or am going, to kind of tie the circle back to my personal story, is I don't know how you all react to images like what Mary showed and her story, but I'm really compelled by that. I'm really motivated to change something. And as Sherry was talking about, viewing my personal diet in terms of its impact on the ecosystem is one way that I have seen that I can begin to make a difference. But professionally, as I shared earlier, some of the research in my lab, which I never really thought would be able to connect to issues like poverty and food, just by branching out a little bit into the area of plant nutrition, it holds promise for actually helping, to solve a problem. And I think, in fact, that applying science in a judicious way, not in a reckless way, but in a judicious way, to improve plants or to make plants more better tailored, for example, to an environment, better able to grow under an eco-agricultural system rather than a monoculture system. I'm very interested in all of those areas.
That's great.
I've become more interested in food and teaching about food through traveling and seeing coffee farmers in Guatemala and Oaxaca and Brazil, and seeing banana pickers in Costa Rica, and recognizing that our consumption patterns here in the United States have a ripple effect globally. And we do not pay the true price for the particular foods that we eat. And so it's sort of a goal in parts of my classes to try to bring this awareness to students, that when you eat a banana, that it has traveled an enormous amount has a lot of food miles on it. The people that picked that banana were exploited enormously. That there's huge subsidies that go into being able to have that banana. That it's ridiculous that 5 transnational companies globally control 90% of all the coffee that's consumed in the world. And that you've got women that are sorting coffee beans in Ethiopia that are making, if they're lucky, 80 cents to $1 a day, while Americans happily go through a drive-through coffee place, right? This is incredible, right? You don't even get out of your car. They didn't have these. I know you guys are young, but I remember when I was your age, you didn't have drive-through coffee stands. They drive through in their car and they buy a cup of coffee and they slurp that down, and you got people drinking 8, 9, 10 cups of coffee every day, and they don't even realize that they're not paying the true price for this. And they're making these transnational corporations incredibly rich while exploiting people. So there's a lot of blood-stained coffee that people drink. In the United States, looking at food production across scales, looking at it from the global to the local, and looking at how our consumption patterns are tied into the way people are living their lives in different places around the world, and how we can change that through food consumption practices here in the United States.
Thank you.
I indicated that I've long been interested in some of these issues that David has been talking about, and the ways that our food choices imply broad ethical values, environmental values, and my research is actually in the politics of knowledge, and I think the philosophy of food is one important way to ground our knowledge back in some of those concrete issues, and make our knowledge practices accountable to trying to make our lives more responsible. But if I had to say in 1 minute how my teaching about food has affected
Or your personal interaction, yeah.
I guess teaching about food in my environmental ethics class has helped me be aware of some of the complexity of these issues, because we read in that class authors from a variety of cultures and social perspectives, and there's a lot of complex issues here about, for instance, organic food. We have some authors who represent the workers now that organic food is trendy, for instance, you have big corporations who are producing organic food but don't really care about the workers, don't really care about whether they're using lots of resources to produce that food. So this is to give one example we read about in environmental ethics. Now that organic fruits are very popular in the United States, I think it's in Baja, Mexico, some area of Mexico maybe you know about. They're producing boutique organic strawberries to ship to North America, but the people in that area now don't have water for their own farms for their local food, because all the water in the community is going to produce the organic strawberries to ship to the United States. So teaching about it at least has brought out the complexity of some of these issues.
That's great. So again, the connections. Because of where we are, I'd like to open the floor for questions for the panelists. I've been asking a lot of questions, and I could ask more, but I'm not going to You can keep the answers sort of brief so more people can ask, and also if you can repeat the question in case people didn't hear it, that would be really helpful.
Yes, he asked, could I share some observation about any of the basic care of infants from the first to the 6 months? Did I get your question right? Sure. Actually, I started to do some research knowing full well that there was this paradox before I left. And in doing that research, back in 1969, yikes, what was happening was that researchers were finding that wherever the baby bottle went, babies were dying. And that's because the formula that was being touted as improving the chances of your baby's survival by Nestle's and other big companies and so on didn't understand the conditions of the tropics, sometimes with mothers who didn't have the benefit of literacy, so they couldn't read what's on the label. And so you spend precious dollars rather than using your own sustainable farming right here to buy this stuff, and you'll dilute it, so it'll go further, but you dilute it with water that may have not been boiled. The baby bottle is hard to take care of. Women in East Africa in particular, where I was, were working 16 and a half hours a day. And didn't have the time to do that. So I hypothesized that the bottle was the factor, but I got there and found out, in fact, it wasn't. And it wasn't because the value for breastfeeding was still very strong among the Kilimanjaro women. So there wasn't a problem with infant mortality. That was more prevalent in their neighbors who were Maasai pastoralists. And wherever pastoralists are, you're going to find an increase in infant mortality simply because they happen to inhabit very dry areas without clean water available. And they're proximate to their animals, and so the problem and challenge of hygiene is very great. So the Chaga people's infant mortality was low, but the child mortality, these toddlers who were being weaned from their mother's breast, that was the problem. So.
Please.
Yeah, you guys touched on this a little bit, but I was just wondering your take on food ethics and the fact that food is so cheap in the U.S. that we are wasting about 40% of what we buy. Food production 50% in the future. So what is your take on that?
Anyone?
Or ethicist, the philosopher.
No pressure.
I also was a little surprised when he said we had to raise. I don't know actually the specifics about how much food we need to feed everybody in the world, but I had read many things, beginning with Francis Moore Lepay back in the 80s, who argued that it's not the amount of food we have available, but the way we organize our resources. So for instance, it's not just about increasing food production, but using the land not to grow those organic strawberries to ship to the United States, or not to grow cattle, which is very resource intensive, but using it in a way that is more sustainable rather than, and I'm sure that's what you meant too. So it's not, what I heard, it's not just producing faster and more, because sometimes that also makes people think, well, we need more pesticides, we need to use our land to produce as much food as possible per acre, but that's probably not what you were thinking, right? I think that mindset of producing more and more sometimes turns into making each plot of land as productive as possible and producing as much food as possible, which then becomes an argument for not farming sustainably. And in the long run, as some of you have argued, that's not the best way to feed people.
The reason why we throw out 40% of our food in the United States is directly related to the way that we live our lives in the United States. You drive your car to a supermarket that has a huge parking lot in it. You go in, you buy food for 2 weeks, 3 weeks at a time. And you end up throwing out a lot of that food, right? If we lived in more walkable communities where you weren't filling up the back of your sports utility vehicle with like all these things that you just could not afford not to buy, then you wouldn't end up throwing them out in the long run. That if it's all about the way that we organize our lives in the United States is related to a lot of it's related to the mechanisms of how people in the United States burn through so many resources enormously. I mean, the statistic that you came up with, the amount of food that we throw out, we can also look at that about the amount of energy that we use for air conditioning, for heating, for electricity, the amount of gas that we burn through all of these different kind of things. So it becomes also how these three disciplines or two disciplines, well, how academia also studies food, and these particular ways that we look at food are interrelated. Well, then you also have to look at our consumption patterns in relation to food and also how we live our lives.
Yeah, that statistic, that increase, that projection, it's a number that's been converged upon by a number of different groups who have looked at the question, and there are obviously, to model something like that, there are a number of assumptions. One is that essentially the countries that currently consume a lot of meat will continue to do so. Countries that are rapidly growing in population are also beginning a much more consumptive lifestyle, particularly with respect to meat, which is very input intensive because it's, as you move up the food chain, you become really less efficient with the calories. You're condensing them, and so you require more inputs to generate meat than vegetable protein. And so that number, most people seem to trust it. The estimate that the world population by 2050 will be 9 billion. That's sort of the working number that most people seem to hold out there. And so the 50% increase in productivity is really talking about assuming that we cannot increase arable land, which we're using about 95%, people think, of how much land there is to be farmed. We're already farming it.
I think that it's really ironic to say that that's assuming we can increase arable land when so much of the land, even right here in Ohio, is being used to grow corn that goes into ethanol, as David mentioned. And I went to a Farm Bureau-sponsored educational meeting for farmers last spring, in which the Farm Bureau representative was telling the farmers, the new trend in farming is you need to lease your land to gas and oil companies to fracture the shale, and that's where farming is going. Farmers have to produce oil now. So it seems like there's a lot of contradictions here.
Plus
saying there's
the
not
amount of arable land that's lost to suburbanization in the United States is ridiculous.
And there's also this contradiction with, we need to grow more food because there's not enough food available, but yet one of the biggest health problems in the United States is obesity, and there's so much effort put into addressing the obesity problem. So I don't have the answers, but it just seems like a statistic like that can be rethought in terms of these some.
Right, because we have huge subsidies for corn, and then that's when you go to the Kroger and you buy a loaf of wheat bread, and the third ingredient is corn syrup. Why is there corn syrup in my wheat bread? What's going on there? So it doesn't mean we don't need golden brown. We don't need to have that in our food, and so you could be using that corn instead of putting it into fuel or to make my bread golden brown, to be planting other crops.
We're going to need you young people to help find some outs that we have, because we have, through mechanized agriculture, least efficient form of food production. That is, for each can of corn that we have, we put in so much energy to get that can of corn for our calories. And that is because we plant it with petroleum products. We use mechanized machines that have to be kept up and maintained. We use fertilizer, again, with petroleum products, often pesticides with them. And then the stuff has to be harvested, again, machines to ship it to wherever it's going to get processed. Then the complexity of processing the food and packaging it and then shipping it to the grocery store, and then all of us who have to drive to get to the grocery store. But guess what? Jobs are attached to all that. So what's the out? And a lot of young people, actually college-age students, are coming up with strategies to deal with food wastage. You know, like finding out that there's an event that's held here on campus and there might be extra food, and then finding out how you can most efficiently, through use of the internet, deliver that food to, say, a soup kitchen or a community who will redistribute it appropriately. So there's lots of strategies, but how to move from our food production system, for which so many of our jobs attach to, and change it so that it's more efficient, is a dilemma. And I don't know how to solve it.
Well, one of the things that tips this, you were asking about outs, there's a lot of financial drivers in all of these questions, and the one thing that's not getting cheaper or easier is our health. And so what you're starting to see is, in my field, in health promotion, but in public health more broadly, a lot of money being tied to corporations and other employers who are trying to reduce their costs, and finding that the way to do that is through healthier behaviors. And when we dig deeper, the questions are not just how many nutrients are in something, but why is it so nutrient void? And it starts to go to these questions, and then we need these people to solve those issues. And so I think, I'm optimistic, but I think that it takes something that people really sit up and pay attention to, and it might be health and cost of healthcare that sort of drives some change, some real change in some of that stuff. So it's an interesting discussion. So I think you had a question here.
That's a great question. The question is, most of what we hear about genetically engineered foods, they're foods that are produced on massive scale, for example, corn or wheat or things like that, and are there any examples, I think I understood you right, are there any examples of a more, can I use the word subsistence application for genetic modification? This is a great question. I think that genetic modification of plants is misunderstood, to say the least. I think to answer your question most directly, and then we can get into maybe some more dialogue if some of the rest of you have questions about that. There are a couple of excellent examples. I would posit that the reason most of the genetically modified foods that we see out there are mass scale is because they're patented. They're owned by large agrochemical companies, and they favor, the continued application, for example, of a particular herbicide that the plant is tolerant to. There are now second and third generation plant biotech projects underway that are, for instance, one of my advisors in graduate school has successfully transformed cassava, which is a subsistence crop, mainly grown in Africa, probably makes up 40% of the calories for a certain region of Africa. To produce, to dissipate, one of the problems with processing cassava, it's a root, and you pound it basically into a kind of a porridge, and that releases cyanide gas. And so most women and their young daughters who do this processing very often end up blind. Blindness, I think, is over 10% for the populations that work with this. And so one of the projects that I'm familiar with was to change cassava so that it still produces, this is an anti-insect response of the plant. The plant's evolved this mechanism to protect itself as a chemical defense. And so the modification of cassava to actually process that cyanide gas faster, to release it faster so that there's less time that it's slowly being released and exposing humans to it. That's a really good example. That's a patent-free thing. That's already in field trials in one of my other friends from graduate school who's on faculty at University of Puerto Rico is working on field trials with that. They've also added certain ways to enhance the protein content of that crop. Kind of a poster child for this was golden rice. You may have heard of it, some of you may have heard of it, but it's been sort of had a lot of trouble getting through trials, basically, out of really fear of what is a genetically modified plant. This is rice that looks golden. Normally rice is white or colorless, and it looks golden because it has high levels of provitamin A. I alluded to this earlier. Vitamin A deficiency results in blindness and is a big problem in the developing world. And so golden rice solves this problem in a completely patent-free, a way that is meant from the outset to be crossed into local land races of rice so that, it can be easily distributed. And so I think it's important that we separate the tool of biotechnology from all of these other political interests, these agribusiness interests. I think there are valid arguments against the latter, right? In terms of patenting DNA, I think is absurd, for example. But in terms of using all of the available technology we have to improve lives, I think is worthwhile at least to consider and not reject because it's got this baggage of being tied to, business interests.
Isn't it often tied to business interests through the funding?
Absolutely. So what started to happen, it's a great point. So it's tied to business interests because those companies are making large investments in the research and development of these products, mainly because the land-grant universities got out of that business more. They were sort of regulated out of it, arguably by business interest lobbying, starting in the late 70s and then until now. Used to be that land-grant colleges like Ohio State and places like it, they would be sort of the storehouse for the cultivars of seeds that farmers in those states would grow. And they do none of that now. All of that is in private hands, which I think was a big mistake.
If it's short, we probably have time for one more question. I saw a hand back there first. So, yeah. Yep.
So I wanted to go back to the idea of the local food idea. So the idea of local food is something that will help alleviate a great amount of problems with the food crisis. But what do we do about developing countries that have the water crisis going on? People bathing in water, having unclean water. So water plays, I think we forget a lot of times that water plays a huge role in food growing. So if we have a huge problem with the water crisis, both the water decreasing in the amount that we have due to global warming, and also the water that's clean is decreasing as well. So what do we do about the food crisis that's related to the water crisis? Going back to the idea of local food.
Well, when food is exported, it's usually exported to wealthy countries like the United States. So if there's a water crisis, and for instance, where are you thinking of?
Well, I was just thinking back to East Africa, where Mariana studied, and it was the idea that water crisis in
What's the most arable land in East Africa? What is it used for? So it seems to be, if you shifted the production of crops, you use the most arable land to feed people locally, that would eliminate some of these problems as far as water goes. And also often crops are grown in particular places where they shouldn't be grown. While you have, for example, in California, we have water-intensive crops like alfalfa that have been grown in the Imperial Valley, and cotton in the Imperial Valley, and in East Texas, cotton's a big, huge production of cotton in East Texas, and it's all irrigated land that is coming out of, in the case of California, out of the Colorado River, and they're taking water for hundreds and hundreds of miles. They're diverting the water in order to grow these particular crops. So also rethinking what grows best in the best place.
Whoa. And I think Carly also noticed, I used to tell students all the time that below Kilimanjaro, that's where the pastoralists were, because you couldn't grow anything. And I lied, because as she saw, that area was all cleared out, and it was cleared out with people who weren't Tanzanians, people from the Middle East. China has its eye on land that's used for pastoralism, for food production for China. So this is a challenge with how to distribute food equitably, so that people who have less power and greater poverty also get a piece of the pie.
Great. Well, in the interest of keeping us on our time, I'm going to cut things generally off, but it's my hope that the audience, I've certainly felt this, that we see how food crosses disciplines. I mean, I think that's become pretty clear, but not just crosses it, weaves into and through those disciplines, and hunger and social values and problem solving. So we'll be highlighting a range of these sorts of work throughout the series, and while they're intended to represent a range, it's not the range. I mean, there are so many angles and areas to focus on. We feel that the speakers throughout the series will be bringing that right here to campus. Thanks to the panelists, of course, for all their expertise, and to the audience and your attendance and your attention and engagement. If you're interested, as I mentioned, in telling us why food is important to you, there's a table back there, as well as these fantastic, probably the coolest shirt I've ever seen, for sale to benefit the Early Childhood Center and their engagement with food on a much better level. The next event is Florence Read next Monday night at 7 p.m. That's the 17th at 7 p.m. right here. She's the president and founder of Sustainable Harvest International. She's won numerous awards in her work. She's changed lives, economies, and environments, all in the things that she's done, and she's just a fascinating person. You can check the website for the details of the other events, and we do hope to see you again throughout the series. Good night.